Hey guys, in today's video we're going to be understanding what the exposure triangle is and everything related to it. I'll first go through shutter speed, then aperture, and then finally ISO because that is going to require some more in-depth explanation. But anyway guys, let's get started now. At the end of the day, photography is just about capturing photons on a sensor or on film or whatever you use. So photography is just capturing the world the way you see it with your camera, with your phone, or with any other recording device. So now that we understand what the hell photography even is, now we can get into the more complex stuff. Just quickly, the exposure triangle is called the exposure triangle because it's controlled with three settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So let's get into shutter speed. Shutter speed, it basically determines how long the camera shutter is open for. But what the hell even is a camera shutter anyway? The way I like to think about it is it's basically like a curtain in a play. So imagine you're sitting at a play and then they roll out the curtain to reveal the players. That's basically how it is. So the camera rolls back the shutter to reveal the sensor hiding behind it. So if you use that explanation, it's pretty logical what the shutter speed is. So it's basically how long this motion is going for. So 1/1000th of a second, for example, then this motion of rolling back and forth, that happens in 1/1000th of a second. If for 1 second, it happens in 1 second, and so on. You with me still? Okay, great. As you can see, guys, I've got my camera here, and you can see here that inside here is a mirror, okay, because I have a DSLR, and that just means that there's a mirror here that bounces light up to the viewfinder so I can see exactly what the sensor sees. But now it's set to 1 second, okay? So I press this button right here, the shutter button, and then it reveals that. And basically what that just did was it just took a picture.
Yeah, no shit, Sherlock!
And it won't look like anything right now because I don't have a lens attached, but as you guys can see, the shutter, it moves up, reveals the sensor inside, and then that's how it takes a picture. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, I've set the exposure or the shutter speed to 1/8000th of a second. That's as fast as this camera can go. And then look at this. It goes super fast, okay? So that's basically what shutter speed does. Now, let's move on to aperture. I know that when I first got my camera, aperture was the confusing part for me because I didn't really know what it was. And the guy at the store that told me, he didn't explain it so well, and obviously because he needed to get through pretty fast, he didn't explain it in enough detail for me to understand. So in a lens, there's an opening for light to come in. It's basically like your eye, and when it's darker, then your pupil, it opens, and then when it's lighter, then it closes to let more or less light in. And that's basically exactly what the lens does, except you control it with your camera. The lens dictates how big the opening can be. So for example, my Sigma lens here, it can open to a f ratio of f1.4, and that can be calculated by the focal length of the lens. That just basically means how zoomed in the lens is, and in my case this one is 30 millimeters, and that's almost like your 1x zoom on an iPhone camera. My camera doesn't exactly equate to 30 millimeters because of the sensor size, but we'll get into that shortly. So to put it simply, aperture is basically the opening that the lens makes to let in more or less light. Aperture also dictates one more important thing: the blurriness of the background in your photo. And that stuff that's out of focus, that's the out of focus blurry effect I really like, and that looks more professional in photos. You can do this in portrait mode on your iPhone, for example, but it doesn't really actually render the background out of focus. It's just because it just mimics that effect. And that's also why it needs its separate mode. But anyway, let's check this out in practice, shall we? One really important thing to realize about aperture and how smooth the background is as well is also how far away your subject is from the background. For example, look at these two pictures. The difference between them isn't the aperture, but it's the distance from the subject of the photo to the background. So if you really want those blurry backgrounds and smooth backgrounds that you see all over social media, you're gonna wanna keep your subject very far away from your background that you have in the photo. Because no matter what your f-stop is, you're still gonna be getting a lot more of that background in focus. So please guys, remember that. All right, now onto ISO. It is the only setting out of the three on the camera that doesn't actually capture more photons or let in any more light onto the sensor if you edit the settings. When you're in a situation where you can't open the aperture even more because it's dark and you opened it, the maximum the lens it can go, or you need the fast shutter speed because you're shooting fast moving targets, then that's when ISO needs to go up. ISO is the only setting out of the three on the camera that does not allow more light to come in and hit the sensor. And so therefore there is no actual artistic reason for having a lower high ISO unless you want better image quality, which you can see with lower ISOs. An important thing to note though is that ISO, it doesn't actually cause noise or cause low image quality. It's just that it reveals noise. When you take a picture and the shutter rolls back, then you expose the sensor to light, and then photons, which is light particles, hit the sensor, as we already mentioned. Each pixel on your sensor of the camera has a very tiny light sensitive area called a photosite. This photosite converts photons, which is light particles, into electrons, which is basically an electrical signal. So the number of electrons collected is proportional to the amount of light hitting each specific photosite during your exposure. And so what your camera does is it basically reads the electrical signal in each photosite. The measurement that your camera makes is called the signal. What ISO does is it basically amplifies the signal. It's similar to a gain knob on a radio, for example, because as you increase the gain, then the noise, it becomes more apparent because you amplify the signal to increase the volume, but then you also amplify the noise that you don't want. And it's literally as simple as that, guys. So if you have any questions, then you leave them down in the comments below and I'll be answering them as soon as I can. And other than that, I'll see you in the next one, which will be coming out really soon. If you haven't already, please check out my first video on the 3 tips that you can use to start with your photography.